Imagine waking up at dawn on October 1st, 331 BC, somewhere in the dusty plains of northern Iraq. The air tastes of copper and fear, and stretching before you is the largest army the ancient world has ever assembled, over 1 million men, their bronze armor catching the first light like scattered stars across an endless sea of death. You're not here by choice. You're a Macedonian soldier, barely 20 years old, homesick for olive groves you may never see again, following a king who claims to be the son of Zeus but bleeds just like you do. This is the morning of Gaugamela, and history is about to pivot on the edge of a sword held by a 25-year-old who refuses to believe that impossible is anything more than a suggestion. Alexander had been chasing this moment for years, pursuing Darius III across half the known world like a particularly persistent debt collector. The Persian king had fled from their previous encounters at Granicus and Issus, leaving behind his family, his dignity, and increasingly frantic messages offering Alexander half his empire if he'd just please stop following him around. But Alexander wasn't the type to settle for half of anything, a character trait that would eventually kill him, but on this particular morning, made him the most dangerous man alive. The Persian strategy was beautifully simple and completely terrifying. Darius would use the flat plains of Gaugamela to deploy his numerical superiority, crush Alexander's tiny army through sheer mass, and finally get a decent night's sleep without dreaming of Macedonian war cries. He'd even had the battlefield prepared, leveled and cleared to give his scythed chariots room to turn Alexander's phalanx into what ancient military historians politely called casualties and what we might describe as an extremely bad day at the office. What Darius couldn't account for was that Alexander had spent his entire life preparing for this exact type of impossibility. While other princes learned poetry and philosophy, Alexander studied the geometry of violence, the mathematics of fear, and the peculiar physics of how small groups of highly motivated people could punch holes through much larger groups of people who'd rather be literally anywhere else. His father Philip had given him the tools: the Macedonian phalanx, the companion cavalry, and a military machine that treated warfare like an engineering problem. But Alexander brought something uniquely his own, an almost supernatural ability to read a battlefield like a book and rewrite the ending in real time. The night before the battle, while Darius fretted over logistics and Parmenion, Alexander's aging general, suggested they attack under cover of darkness, Alexander did something that reveals everything about who he was. He slept. Not the restless half-sleep of the anxious, but the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had already decided that tomorrow's outcome was inevitable. His soldiers, watching their king snore peacefully while they sharpened weapons and wrote letters they hoped they'd never have to send, drew a kind of desperate comfort from his certainty. If Alexander wasn't worried, maybe they didn't need to be either. Dawn revealed the full scope of Darius's gamble. The Persian line stretched beyond sight, Immortals in their scaled armor, Bactrian cavalry with their curved swords, war elephants from India that moved like walking fortresses, and those infamous scythe chariots that had haunted Greek nightmares for generations. The sound alone must have been overwhelming. The creak of leather, the clink of bronze, the nervous whinnying of horses, and underneath it all, the low murmur of prayers being offered in a dozen languages to gods who would be picking sides before lunch. Alexander's response was typically theatrical and completely insane. Instead of spreading his forces thin to match the Persian line, he concentrated his strength on the right wing and planned to punch through the Persian left like an arrow through parchment. It was a strategy that required perfect timing, absolute discipline, and the kind of luck that made people wonder if he really was descended from gods. The Macedonian phalanx would hold the center, their 18-foot sarissas creating a forest of bronze points that no cavalry charge could penetrate, while Alexander led his companions in a wedge formation aimed directly at Darius himself. The battle unfolded like a deadly dance choreographed by madmen. The scythe chariots, Darius's secret weapon, thundered toward the Macedonian lines only to discover that Alexander's soldiers had practiced this exact scenario. They opened gaps in their formation, let the chariots roll harmlessly through, then closed ranks and continued as if nothing had happened. It was the ancient equivalent of stepping aside to let a runaway cart pass, then calmly returning to your conversation about the weather. Meanwhile, Alexander was conducting his own personal symphony of violence on the right wing. Leading from the front, because apparently someone forgot to explain to him that kings were supposed to stay safely in the rear giving orders, he carved through the Persian left with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work. The sight of their enemy's most famous king charging directly at them, screaming Macedonian war cries and personally introducing Persian nobles to the business end of his lance, had a profoundly demoralizing effect on Darius's forces. The moment that decided everything came when Alexander broke through the Persian line and turned toward Darius's position. The great king, who had spent months preparing for this confrontation, took one look at the young Macedonian bearing down on him like an angry god and made the same decision he'd made twice before: strategic withdrawal, also known as running away as fast as his royal legs could carry him. His flight triggered a cascade of panic that swept through the Persian ranks like wildfire. An army of 1,000,000 men dissolved into a mob of individuals all trying to leave the battlefield simultaneously, creating history's most expensive traffic jam. The aftermath was as swift as it was decisive. In a single afternoon, Alexander had destroyed the last great Persian army, secured his claim to the throne of Asia, and demonstrated that sometimes the most audacious plan is the only one that works. Darius would flee to Bactria, where he'd be murdered by his own nobles, proving that even in ancient times, corporate restructuring could be fatal. Alexander, meanwhile, would march to Babylon, where he'd be welcomed as a liberator by people who were frankly exhausted by the whole Persian Empire experience. Gaugamela wasn't just a military victory, it was the moment when the ancient world shifted on its axis. The battle marked the end of Persian dominance and the beginning of what historians would call the Hellenistic period, 3 centuries when Greek culture, language, and ideas would spread from Egypt to India, creating a cosmopolitan civilization that blended East and West in ways that still echo through our world today. Alexander didn't just conquer an empire, he created a new way of thinking about what empires could be.